Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ilsa Knecht, and I am the Deputy Director of Public Policy for the National Center for Victims of Crime. Welcome to today's webinar, DNA 101, Demystifying CODIS and DNA Profiles for Victim Service Providers. I want to go over a few housekeeping issues for those of you who are not familiar with the WebEx system. This slide is for people who are having trouble hearing us. So we'll wait on that for a second so people can read that. If you have any technical issues during the webinar, including audio problems, please first check your speakers, make sure they're turned on or up, and then call WebEx support at 866-229-3239. I just want to make a note that all participants on this webinar today are muted upon entry. So that means that you will not be able to ask a question verbally, but we do encourage questions, and you can use the question and answer tool in the WebEx system. I'm going to show you in a minute what that looks like. Here we go. Let's see, sorry. Okay, we're in the full screen view now, and if you look at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you can see a little floating toolbar, and there you will see a question mark icon. If you click that, that will open the question and answer panel, and you can pose a question that way. If during the webinar you are in the split screen view, which you have the option of doing, you'll see a list of sort of different windows at the side of your screen. You can open the question and answer toolbar there as well by clicking on the Q&A line. It usually has a little arrow next to it which will maximize it for you. So this is what it looks like. The little WebEx toolbar will pop up like it is shown here on this slide. Okay, you just type your question in the small box at the bottom and hit the send button. Your answers are not going to be seen by other attendees, just the panelists. And we will do our best to answer questions today at the end of the presentation. If we don't get to your question today, we will follow up with you by email. I want to also note that the chat function is not enabled for this webinar, so if you need to reach us, just use that question and answer tool. And also, I've had this question a bunch of times before. You will not be able to see how many participants are on the webinar, so you are not the only person here. We actually have about 103 people right now. And when you logged in, you may have noticed at the right side of your screen that we are taking a poll. I hope everyone got a chance to complete the poll. If not, please do that soon. We'll be closing it in a few minutes. Don't forget to hit submit to send us your answers. And just a note that some of you, if you have trouble with the polling, if you can't see that panel, that just sometimes happens with different programs that people are looking at the webinar. But for those of you who can take the poll, if you could do that now, that would be great. Okay. I want to just take a few minutes to tell you a little bit about the National Center before I turn the webinar over to our presenter. The National Center's mission is to forge a national commitment to help victims of crime rebuild their lives. And we do this through direct support to all victims of crime on our National Crime Victim Helpline, 1-800-FYI-CALL. There, victims can get information about victim compensation, safety planning, and learn about their legal rights and, among other support they can get on FYI-CALL. We provide training and technical assistance to those who work with victims, and we work with Congress to secure rights and protections for victims and funding for various victim services. Since about 2002, the National Center has been focusing on increasing understanding of forensic DNA and DNA technology among those who work with victims and just about anybody else who will listen to us. We know that solving more cases and preventing more crime is important to many victims and to society in general, and we can do this by maximizing the potential of DNA technology. We are very excited to have begun this new project with the support from the Office for Victims of Crime. I'd like to say, actually, it's a DOJ Recovery Act grant that we got. Our goal is to ensure that professionals who work with victims have the most up-to-date information about DNA so they may provide accurate guidance to victims whose cases are involving DNA evidence. This DNA 101 webinar is the first webinar in a series of 8 that are geared towards an audience of victim service professionals. Our next webinar will be on March 2nd on the important role that sexual assault nurse examiners play and providing a competent and compassionate response to survivors of sexual assault and other crimes. Some of the other topics will include working with victims in cold cases and post-conviction appeals and exonerations, using DNA to solve missing persons cases, and I think we have another one on, no, that's it actually. I think that's our list so far. So stay tuned for more announcements about those webinars. We'll be holding a 2-day training in May in Indianapolis, and that is a free training. So information will be posted about that training opportunity on our website in the coming weeks. And I want to advertise that the National Center has created a listserv for those who are interested in DNA-related issues. And we have developed materials about forensic DNA for victims and professionals who work with victims. You're looking at the web address for our online DNA Resource Center website. And all of the materials I mentioned and announcements about future webinars and trainings will be posted on this website. In late February, we're going to be adding more resources to this website, including an online DNA quiz and interviews with professionals in the field and survivors who have important stories to tell about the power of DNA. Here is my contact information. If you want to email me with any questions, or if you'd like to join our DNA listserv, you can also email me as well. You can call me up. And looks like some folks are still taking the poll. We're going to need to close the poll in just a minute, probably about 15 seconds, and then we'll hear from our speaker today. Okay. Our speaker is Angelo Della Manna, and we are really lucky to have him with us as he brings loads of experience to the field, in the field to this webinar. Angelo is the Chief of Forensic Biology and DNA for the State of Alabama, Department of Forensic Sciences. He directs the forensic biology and DNA efforts in 4 regional casework DNA laboratories throughout Alabama, as well as the statewide DNA Databank Laboratory. He has over 17 years of experience and has testified as an expert witness in the field of forensic biology and DNA in both state and federal courts, and he is one of the 7 members of the FBI's Executive Board for DNA Analysis Methods. He has published his DNA research findings in the Journal of Forensic Science and has been an invited speaker at several national forensic DNA conferences. Angelo has also been featured on the Discovery Channel documentary series, The New Detectives, as well as CBS News' 60 Minutes program in their recent episode focused on the future of forensic DNA testing. Today, Angelo will give an overview of the forensic DNA testing process, including how forensic DNA profiles are generated from evidence, what information they contain, how CODIS functions, and a bit about privacy protections. You will also learn about familial searching and legislative trends related to DNA collection. Welcome, Angelo. Oops, I think I have
to partner with the National, I'm really pleased to partner with the National Center to help in a collective effort to really educate and hopefully provide the victim service professionals with some accurate and timely information about this great field that we call forensic biology and DNA. And I certainly hope that the presentation I'm providing today is both informative and educational. I certainly encourage you to submit any kind of questions that you would like me to elaborate on. I'm certainly more than happy to do so. What I'm going to do today is cover some of the main topics. Certainly, the last 20 years have just been exponential in the technological advances in DNA. From when I began about 18 years ago to now, it's been literally night and day what we're able to do with DNA testing in a forensic setting. I'm going to go over some of that. I'm also going to go over the latest updates in regard to CODIS, which is the Combined DNA Index System, or what's commonly referred to as the National DNA Database. Some of the future issues that we're going to deal with in forensic DNA testing, both privacy-related, technology-related, et cetera, and try and give you an update on where the state of the state is, depending on what state you're in, as well as the national level, what laws are present and forthcoming at the legislative level, both in your state and at the federal level. So just recently, I'd like to go over just some of the recent DNA highlights. Certainly DNA is not just used in a forensic setting, but we have seen in the last several years there's been a large increase in the number of cold case efforts that are being used throughout the United States, a lot of that is through federal grant funding that is dedicated to going back and looking at cold cases. Those are primarily sexual assault cases where the rape kit has been stored on a property room shelf that would have been collected before the advent of DNA testing. So for those of you who may not know, the DNA database law at the federal and state levels really only came into effect in the early 90s, in 1994 at the federal level. And so prior to that, if a woman was assaulted, let's say in the 80s, and there was no known suspect, a lot of those sexual assault kits never made it to a crime lab setting because there was nothing to compare it to. And so a lot of our efforts, both here in Alabama and at the national level, have been on going back to those law enforcement agencies and trying to see if those rape kits still exist, and if so, to do DNA testing upon the evidence and then compare it to the National Offender Database. The other main use of DNA has been used certainly in the 9/11 tragedy to try and identify the unidentified human remains. I put in quotes here that has been virtually completed. A lot of the remains certainly have been tested and the identifications completed. However, as they continue to rebuild around ground zero, as recently as the last few months, some of the utility crews, et cetera, are also still finding little bones and certain remains that are still undergoing some testing. For those of you in states that have a statute of limitations on sexual assault, New York comes to mind. A lot of interest has been garnered in John Doe arrest warrants, and that is designed to keep a case open to allow the successful prosecution of a perpetrator after the statute is routinely expired. And by that I mean usually what happens is if you have a statute of limitations in your state, then literally right before the statute would be to expire, if there is a DNA profile in that case, then the warrant for that individual would be filed to keep it open, and the name would be John Doe, and they would actually put the DNA profile in there to keep that case active. Certainly, database expansion continues throughout the country, both to collect from all felons as well as additional trends that I'll go into, and familial searching is something that is certainly new to our country that I'll also talk about. So in general, the other uses of DNA, certainly not just in a forensic setting. The vast majority of the public certainly understands that DNA would be used in a paternity setting to resolve child custody issues in a civil court, for example. Missing persons investigations are also routinely use DNA to try and identify human remains that may be found in one state and then identify them as the offspring of two biological parents. The World Trade Center attack that I alluded to, certainly a large use of DNA in that effort, as well as recently the military has begun collecting DNA from all its enlisted personnel. So years ago, everybody remembers that the military would routinely issue the metal dog tags to you. Now they collect a biological sample that is stored in the Northeast in a repository, and then if need be, it can be pulled and compared to the remains that would have been arrived at in a military setting. So real generally, what is DNA? Well, DNA is the basic building block of life. It's a chemical code that is present within each and every one of us, and it's the same within each and every one of us. It is found in virtually every cell of your body that is a nucleated cell, so the only exception will be the red blood cell. The only exception to the uniqueness requirement is identical twins. And there are two types of twins. There's fraternal twins and identical twins. The vast majority of individuals are fraternal twins, but the identical twins have the exact same genetic makeup or the same DNA. The DNA that is present throughout your body is the same, so in your hair, saliva, blood, etc., the DNA profile that is present in each of those cells is the same. And that's important to us in a forensic setting because it allows us to compare the DNA profile of a hair that is found at a crime scene, for example, against a known DNA profile from an individual that might be a saliva swab or a blood sample. You don't have to have a hair from the suspect to compare against the hair from the crime scene. You can take the DNA of the offender from blood or saliva and then compare that to the resulting DNA profile from the hair. Certainly in the forensic setting, DNA is really used in these four main areas. The different types of DNA testing that are used are probably 99% of the forensic casework that happens is in nuclear DNA testing. That is the type of DNA that I described earlier that's present in virtually every cell of your body and is passed on to you equally from your mother and your father. There is a small percentage of cases that are mitochondrial DNA, and that is primarily in some challenge samples or would be human remains or hairs that don't have a root. That type of testing is not as discriminating as the nuclear testing because that type of DNA, that mitochondrial DNA, is passed on to you only from your mother, so along the maternal lineage. And so any siblings would have the same mitochondrial profile as the individual. The four main areas that we focus on are DNA data bank analysis. We have begun a constructive effort throughout the forensic community in looking at missing persons cases and orchestrating our forensic index to try and identify unidentified human remains from throughout the country. Casework certainly is the vast majority of the work that we do, routine day-to-day casework. And recently, depending on the state, there is post-conviction legislation to allow us to go back and look at some of the cases where individuals may have been convicted based solely on witness testimony, et cetera, before the advent of DNA, and then try and either confirm or refute those convictions using DNA testing. So in a criminal case, I want to walk you through just kind of a general overview of what happens within the laboratory to try and give you an idea of what happens to a case from beginning to the end. The main types of cases that we encounter in a crime lab setting are listed here. Sexual assault, homicide make up by far the vast majority of our cases throughout the community, and those are certainly the types of cases where you would envision DNA evidence being routinely left at the scene of a crime. Assault, robbery, and burglary, we've been more aggressive here in Alabama as well as throughout the community in going out and working these crimes against property such as burglaries and break-and-enters, because if we can identify the individual in those crimes early on, then they will be present within the database, and if and when they escalate to sexual assault, you'll be able to identify them. So within a laboratory, the general forensic exam works from the very general questions to the very specific. So here, where I have the basic serology, where I'm trying to examine a stain to see is that stain indeed a blood stain? Well, the very general question would be, is that reddish-brown stain that I'm seeing on the axe or the clothing, is that a blood stain? Or is it ketchup, Taco Bell sauce, whatever the case may be? There's a series of chemical tests that we can do to test for a component of blood. If it is indeed a blood stain, then we want to know, is it a human blood stain, or is it a dog blood, deer blood, cat blood, et cetera? And if indeed those tests are positive, we go straight to DNA and try and characterize the DNA profile at that point. For semen stains routinely encountered in cases of sexual assault, the approach is a little bit different. Under routine ambient light or outside light or fluorescent lighting within a laboratory, it's extremely difficult to find a semen stain. So we employ a variety of alternate light sources, here referred to as ALS, to see if we can find the semen stain that would glow in the dark under a certain alternate light source known at a certain wavelength. A lot of biological stains will fluoresce. It's not just semen, but it allows us a method to document a potential stain, to circle that and trace the outlining margins of it, and then to do some chemical tests on it to see if we can identify spermatozoa present within the stain. if indeed we do find semen or we characterize the stain as a human stain, blood stain, etc., certainly the next thing we want to do is to develop the DNA profile of that donor. And I put this slide in here because it is important to note that, especially as we go back and work on cold cases, that the quality of the evidence collection on the front end has a direct impact on the DNA results on the back end. And I say that because in cold cases, as we've gone through and looked at a lot of evidence from the 70s and the 80s, if you think back to those time periods, it was not routine practice back then in a lot of law enforcement agencies to wear gloves and things of that nature at a crime scene. So we have seen some mixtures of samples that wouldn't necessarily be deemed mixtures initially, where you've got a potential contaminant on the evidence sample just because of the nature and the time period that it was collected. But as we begin the DNA testing process within the lab, the first step is DNA extraction. And in extraction, all we're really doing here is breaking open the cell of the nucleated cell. So if you think about DNA being much like an egg, as we break open the egg, which would be the cell, what we're focusing on at this point is getting to the yolk. There's a nice central nucleus within each cell. We want to recover that and then purify it. And then at that point, we want to move forward with our next step. But essentially, we want to get the blood stain and the semen stain and the saliva stain, whatever the case may be, off of whatever substrate it's on. So if it's on clothing or sheets or swabs from the vaginal cavity in the case of sexual assault, etc., we want to get to the cell, break open the cell, and release the DNA to a point that we can purify it, and then move on to the next step. The next step involves DNA quantitation. That is essentially a pretty straightforward process that allows me to measure a couple of things. Number one is, how much DNA have I got in that particular sample? Is it enough to me to go through and characterize a complete DNA profile? As well as this particular step will also give me an indication if there's any kind of inhibitors present that might prevent me from developing a profile. Now, it's important, I think, to try and relate to individuals who may not know that with our advances in DNA testing here in Alabama and a lot of places throughout the country, that 1 nanogram is the target. So for me to get results that are just in the sweet spot, just textbook results that look like you would envision them in a training session, what I want out of my stain is 1 nanogram for every microliter. And to give you an idea of how much DNA 1 nanogram is, the standard paper clip in America, the small little silver gem clips that you use to hold papers together, those are manufactured to weigh exactly 1 gram. And so if you take one of those paper clips, cut it in 1 billion pieces, one of those pieces would be 1 nanogram. So you can get an idea of how sensitive the DNA testing process is in the laboratory, which is great for from an evidence standpoint, but it's also important to also understand that with that sensitivity, you can see how we routinely do detect contaminants at the crime scene level. So once we know how much DNA we got, then we perform what's known as the PCR process here. That essentially just mimics within a laboratory setting, which your body does each and every day, all day. It is a way to take very specific and targeted areas on the DNA molecule and make billions of copies to the point that you can visualize it. And so by that I mean that if you were going through your normal day-to-day activities, you are routinely shedding cells throughout the course of your day. Now, if you, for example, sustained a cut to your hand, what usually would happen there is within an hour or so you would start to get a scab, and a couple of days later that scab may fall off, and depending on the severity of the injury, you may or may not have a scar. Well, what has happened throughout that entire time period is your body has gone back to your DNA data bank and just continually regenerated cells of that same DNA profile. And so within a laboratory setting, we're essentially doing the same thing. We look at very small pieces of DNA, and then focus on those areas that are very different from individual to individual, so that will allow us to tell individuals apart very readily. So at the end of the testing process, which you have before you on the screen now, this is a complete DNA profile. And each of those areas where you see peaks, where there's 2 peaks across each colored row, those represent a different address on the DNA. So if you think of the DNA molecule being like a street map or a road map, at each of these areas, so across the top of the screen you can see there's 4 different areas, each with 2 peaks within them. Those would be like 4 different street addresses, each independent of the other. And the DNA areas that we look at are non-coding DNA regions, so it's commonly referred to as junk DNA. So the DNA profiles that we develop, they can't tell you, the race of the individual. I can't tell you the eye color of an individual. I can't tell you any kind of predisposition for any genetic diseases, because all the areas that we look at, while they're very informative in the forensic setting because they do differ from person to person, they're not linked, they're not coding regions. So the only thing that a forensic DNA profile can tell you is the sex of the donor, and that is represented in the lower left-hand corner, right above the, which should be the orange peaks on your screen. You'll see an X with a red peak, and that is indicative of a female, because that is an area of the DNA that we refer to as the sex chromosomes. So all males on the planet are X and Y. So if it was a male, this is from a blood stain, if it was a male blood stain, you would see one peak being an X, and then just to the right of that you would see another peak that would be just as high that would say Y, because it would be just next to it. The fact that you only have the larger X peak, again, indicates that this is from a female. But that's the only kind of information that that we can discern from a DNA profile. The other regions are non-coding. So then, once I have the DNA profile from an evidence sample depicted there on the right, again, female, because you can see on the bottom it has just the X peak. We then compare the complete DNA profile to the DNA profiles of individuals in the case and see, do the patterns match? And by that we mean, do they match at each and every location? And within the location, do they have the same number of peaks or repeat units within them? And so you can see clearly that the pattern on the left, represented as the known standard, which would be the victim in this case, does match the pattern on the right, which is the evidence from the crime scene. And so once a match is obtained, then that individual would be included as a potential contributor. Then we want to calculate a statistic that essentially uses population genetics and some basic statistical principles to calculate how often would we expect to see that match. And now, looking at the variety of different areas on the DNA that we do look at, it gets so specific that we're routinely saying that the chance of finding that individual profile in an unrelated random population is very often in the trillions and quadrillions. So now let me move on to CODIS. CODIS is the Combined DNA Index System. It's the FBI software that essentially allows crime labs throughout America to compare DNA profiles of their offenders against unsolved cases at the national level. The architecture of CODIS is essentially a tiered architecture. So the INDEX at the top is the National DNA Database held at the FBI Academy or at Quantico, and within their laboratory. And there's one line that goes from the FBI national level to each state. And then within each state, depending on the size of the state, there can be one or several connections going down to the local level. So here in Alabama, we have local labs in Huntsville, Birmingham, Montgomery, and Mobile. They generate their own casework within those labs, routinely upload those profiles to the state level in Alabama. We then upload our profiles to national, to the FBI level at national. I put an arrow off to the right. It's for Interpol. It's not a routine search, but now there is, as of last year, a mechanism where if we had an unsolved case and we believed the perpetrator to be from the European Union, for example, because a German driver's license was found next to the body or something to that effect. We do have a way, excuse me, through Interpol now to try and search some of the European Union databases. Okay, so who has CODIS? Well, within the domestic United States, 177 federal, state, and local labs, certainly each state and union, as well as the U.S. Army Crime Lab, which is located in Georgia, the FBI lab in Puerto Rico, as well as the international labs, continues to grow the number of labs that house it. And by that I mean that Belgium, Colombia, et cetera, they have the CODIS software through an agreement with the FBI, but that does not mean that we're searching those profiles within our index. The searches are just within the United States. Also, it's important to know at this point that when you say who has CODIS, it's important to understand who has access to CODIS. There are very strict federal and state laws that restrict access to the national index. It's not over the internet or any of those kinds of intranet kind of connections. It's a dedicated line that goes, again, from Quantico to each state, and it's restricted to government agencies that are the DNA laboratories within those states. Then within that laboratory, there is firewall protections and access levels for only the DNA scientists that have passed the FBI background and deemed to have access to the index. So routinely, weekly actually, there's a search conducted at the national level, and when you hear about there's been a hit on a DNA case, this is essentially the type of search that we're talking about. There's two types of hits really. There's a hit between an offender's DNA profile where he would have had to provide a DNA sample based on a conviction or, depending on the state, on arrest, and that profile was put into the database. And then you have cases that are unsolved. It could be a blood stain from the crime scene. It could be a cigarette butt from another crime scene. And so if those two profiles are searched and match each other, that would be classified as a hit. Now, the other type of search that routinely occurs that is also very informative is where we link case to case. So you can see the arrow on the bottom where the blood stain from case 1 matches the cigarette butt from case 2. So we've identified the serial offender, even though we may not actually know who that person is yet. And then when it does match to an offender's profile, then we would identify a serial rapist, et cetera, in that manner. So let me just real quick go into some of the CODIS success stories to give you an example of how this occurs. From the FBI, they sent out to all the INDIS participating labs off of their website. You can look and find your state to give you an idea of, this is from April of last year, according to the FBI statistics, of how many investigations have been aided by CODIS within your state. And so you can see there's certainly, the number of hits continues to grow as the number of unsolved cases and the number of offenders continues to grow in the national database. And then as of last summer, again, this is the FBI profiles. I just looked at this last week, and we are well over 7 million convicted offender profiles now that are routinely being searched. We have over 250,000 arrestee samples. By forensic, we mean the actual crime scene samples, so we're approaching 300,000 of those DNA profiles, et cetera. And just a few weeks ago, we went collectively just over 8 million DNA profiles that are routinely searched. And when I say routinely searched, what I mean there is that every Monday morning there is an auto search that is executed between all of the offender samples and all the unsolved cases. And then about this time on Monday afternoon, all the individual states will start seeing all the different match messages. So that search is conducted weekly of all the offenders, because certainly every week there's been new offenders and new crime scene samples added to the national index. I put this map up because this is, I think, informative from an intrastate perspective to really demonstrate to individuals the true power of CODIS. You know, the vast majority of law enforcement agencies don't have the time or resources to reach out and talk to agencies that aren't in their jurisdiction. Well, this is a map that I keep of the colored states in green represent states where an offender from their state, colored in green, matched an Alabama unsolved case through a search at the national level. So you can see that individuals from a variety of different states have traveled to Alabama and perpetrated a crime, and then we've identified them as an offender and as the perpetrator in that Alabama case. I also keep the flip side of that. This is a larger number of states where Alabama offenders have traveled and perpetrated crimes in the states colored in green, where their unsolved case has been solved because through a search at the national level where it's been identified as an offender that we put into the national database. And again, just to give you a kind of a demonstration of the consistency of the database and how unsolved cases can stay unsolved for years and eventually get solved. The brutal rape murder of a victim in Smithfield community just outside of Troy, Alabama, Edna Reeves, we excluded over 100 suspects in this particular case. This lady lived alone. She was a widow, and in a very rural farm type community, and over a decade or so, a litany of suspects were submitted. DNA excluded every one of those individuals as being the source of the semen, and then there was an individual who was incarcerated at the time the DNA database law was in effect in '94 initially, and as he got out, he wanted his civil rights restored, so he applied for a pardon so he could vote and purchase a weapon, etc. And it was that particular sample that then eventually hit to the semen from the Reeves case. And that individual is Mason Alex Sims. So you can see how, even though samples are constantly added to the database, as a search happens, if it doesn't hit or doesn't solve a case this week or next week, it's consistently searched. So it's just a matter of time, hopefully, until the individual gets into the database and is linked to that case. So here in Alabama, we have looked at some of our data where we've had hits against unsolved cases and being linked to offenders. And in that case, we've noticed how the Alabama offenders that we had initially collected from all felons, that if we had if we had limited the database to just violent offenders at the time, we would have missed the vast majority of our hits. Let me talk briefly, too, about familial searching. This is a topic that has started to get more and more publicity in the last probably year and a half, and I just want to make sure everyone understands the difference between familial searching and partial matches that may occur in the national database. A familial search is a deliberate trolling of the database where you're not looking for that perfect match. So if you remember that two graphics that I gave that where the two profiles matched exactly, that is your routine type of match. In a familial search, you're looking for close matches, but not the perfect match, because the idea there is to see if you've done the search and haven't found a perfect match, is there a brother or a father that may be in the database that would lead you to the suspect? And that's based on a couple of different premises. Certainly a DOJ survey showed that 46% of prison inmates in the United States had a family member who had been incarcerated. So if the perpetrator may not be in a database. The belief is that, well, maybe his brother or father is in the database, and you could find the perpetrator in that manner. However, to really determine if it could ever be effective in resolving cases, from a forensic standpoint, we need to understand, what is the probability that a first-degree relative from a statistics standpoint would be in the database? And is there any way that we could reduce the number of unproductive candidates? Because, again, it is a statistical estimate. And according to the BJS in the United States, 2 million children have at least one and some both parents incarcerated. So you can see there's a lot of sharing of DNA profiles that may lead to those familial type ties. And that's just a graphic from that study. One way that the National DNA Database has been used was to identify the shoe rapist. This was in the United Kingdom, where they had no leads on the series of sexual assaults, and this individual was identified through his sister, who had a DUI. And when the search was undertaken with a search warrant of his business place, he had a false floor that had all these stiletto heels where he had taken them as trophies of his sexual assaults. More recently, in the state of Kansas, you may have heard of the BTK serial killer. Killed 10 people in Kansas over the course of 17 years, and for decades teased law enforcement periodically with letters saying, "You'll never find me," and things of that nature. When he started with the Otero family and got to Ms. Davis, after 1978, there's really no activity from a forensic standpoint or an investigative standpoint to try and link BTK to an individual. And then recently, just a few years ago, he sent an electronic letter taking credit for Vicki Wegerle's murder in September. And that electronic disk, if you will, had some metadata on it that allowed, from a computer forensic standpoint, to be traced back to a church computer. And from that, they saw that there was a list of individuals that had access to that particular computer, and so they used this kind of reverse familial type DNA, where they went to his daughter's biopsy sample, did the DNA profile from that with a court order, and they compared that to the semen evidence from all those crime scenes to see if, in fact, half of that DNA profile was the same, which it was, and then that was used as the probable cause to go and arrest the BTK killer, which subsequently confessed, who, without that type of approach, really would never have been in a database. He was had no criminal record. He's a Park City, Kansas compliance officer, law enforcement, et cetera, and without any other type of lead, may not have ever been found. So very quickly, just in terms of state legislation, in the mid-90s and then up to 10 years ago, there's only 6 states, Alabama and some others, that required DNA to be collected from all convicted felons. And then you saw in the last probably 10 years that a lot of legislation based on data like I showed earlier, resulting in hits where the individual had a prior for burglary or property crimes, has shown the ability to escalate to sexual assault. That a lot of the other states have gone back now and amended their laws so that they would include DNA to be collected from all convicted felons and not just sex assault and homicides. So as we sit here in 2010, now virtually every state collects DNA from all felony offenders, as well as the federal government and the Department of Defense. Every state in the union does collect from the serious violent felony offenders. Every state also collects from burglary offenders. And then recently there's been a trend, kind of the next wave. The first wave was to move towards everybody collected from all felons. Now it's moving towards people collecting or sampling DNA at the time of felony arrest. So currently in the United States, there's 21 or 22 states that is authorized to collect DNA from arrestees. Not all of them actively have implemented their program yet. Some of them are phased in. Not all laws are created equal. Two that I would note is Minnesota is up there and striped, and from what I understand, they're redoing their law based on a constitutional challenge, and the second one is the federal DNA law, arrestee law, went into effect where up to 1.2 million illegal detainees and immigrants and people detained at a U.S. port of entry would now be required. As of January this year, they started collecting from those samples. So certainly those types of numbers will increase the population of the National DNA Database. Here in Alabama, we expanded our coverage of DNA collections to all felony arrestees, including juveniles that were arrested for any offense or for any sex offense that would require notification as a sex offender, and we'll begin collecting the actual sample October 1st of this year. So I think as a forensic community, we've seen the wave continue that I suspect this year will be much like the last couple of years, that the other states will introduce arrestee testing legislation throughout the U.S. Some states have adopted the approach of, rather than trying to sample people at the time of a felony arrest, that they would rather just expand their database collection to be from all misdemeanors at the point of conviction. From those states if they're resistant to collecting at the point of arrestees. And certainly, much like a lot of the victim service professionals, the forensic labs are in the same boat, that funding to do our basic service will certainly continue to be a challenge. But I thank you all for your time, and certainly would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, thanks so much, Angelo. Can I just first have you talk for just a minute about the sort of the process in the lab of triage is the word that comes to my mind, but we have always got questions from the field about why is it taking so long, and everybody knows about backlogs, but maybe you could talk a little bit about the different priorities that you have to balance in the lab and how you decide what gets tested, and how long does it really take. I guess absent sort of the backlog issue, how long would it take to really get this type of testing done?
Well, I will say that in general, the vast majority of labs do prioritize their cases. They are not actually worked in the order that they come in. The vast majority of them are worked based on a prioritization schedule that involves cases that are public safety danger. Those are the ones that we certainly prioritize. So if you have a serial rapist or a serial killer in the community, you certainly want to work those cases as quick as you can. The next ones that we prioritize in general are cases with a court date, where certainly nobody benefits if cases have to be continued in the criminal justice system. So if we have a firm court date, we will certainly want to make sure the cases are done by that time. And as a general rule, labs throughout the country are shooting for trying to get cases started within 30 days and then completed within 90 days from when they're submitted, so that every one of those people within the criminal justice system can benefit from the DNA testing process.
Oops, I forgot to unmute myself. I wanted to mention that we also opened another poll on the side, so people can, if people could answer that while we're doing questions, that'd be great. I think another question we get a lot of the time, we have one now, what happens generally after a CODIS hits? What's the process?
That's a great question. What happens is when we have a CODIS hit, we notify the local law enforcement agency and send a copy to the district attorney here in our state. And what's required at that point is for them to use that report as probable cause to go and get an additional sample from that individual that is then submitted to the lab to confirm the forensic analysis. And it's generally that sample that's then introduced in court as they proceed with the charges on the specifics of that hit.
Okay, and someone asked if you might be able to touch on touch DNA, to talk a little bit about that. What is it? Why is it useful?
Certainly. Touch DNA, it generally involves, it's kind of a wide term, but it generally involves low template DNA testing. So that would involve, you know, if you swabbed the doorknob or were to just touch a light switch, would you be able to recover DNA from it? The forensic community experience is generally, it's kind of a hit or miss type thing. We do attempt it on crimes against persons cases with limited success because you've got a lot of issues to deal with there. A lot of those samples are traditionally mixtures. You can imagine if you swab a steering wheel, you're not going to get just the last person to touch the steering wheel. You're going to get a variety of individuals, and you may or may not be able to pull out enough of the DNA profile that is searchable within the national index. And I would say it's not always like CBS on Thursday nights with CSI. That although we're willing to try it, the success is limited at this point.
Okay, and here's another one that we've heard quite a bit from the field. Talking about DNA to victims' reference samples and reference samples that are taken, exclusion samples. Did they get entered into CODIS ever, or what happens to them? Are they stored somewhere?
That's another great question. It's important to note that the victims' DNA profiles and elimination samples, which would be, you know, a consensual partner like a husband or a boyfriend samples, by the federal procedures, those samples are not uploaded and searched at the national index. Those are not allowed at the national level for a variety of reasons, and rightfully so, in my estimation. That the only samples that are uploaded are crime scene samples, offender samples, and things of that nature. Victims' profiles are not searched, uploaded or searched at the national level.
Okay, here's one that I'm going to read to you. I don't understand it, but the question is, it seems cross-examination will focus on RMP. Could you explain RMP in simple words and calculating the statistics?
Certainly. RMP is the random match probability. At times that is the focus of the cross-examination, because defense attorneys don't fully understand how can you say that this profile occurs 1 in 1 trillion times when there isn't but 6 billion people on the planet. And the simplest way that, or several different analogies, but a simple one I think that communicates to a jury what we're talking about there is the lottery analogy, where within the course of a lottery you've only got 49 balls in the machine, but from those 49 balls you can generate billions of permutations and combinations. And it's the same thing with a DNA profile. You've got a very set number of areas that you're looking at, but when you're multiplying the frequencies at each and every area together, you're going to generate a random match probability that routinely exceeds the world's population.
Okay. We had a question about non-human DNA tests. Who does that? Do government labs do it? You know, there's sometimes, I guess, can be some non-human DNA that might be helpful in a case.
That's correct. That's a very rare occurrence. So if you had dog hair or cat hair or things of that nature, the animal type forensic DNA testing is not conducted in the vast majority of crime labs throughout this country. The one agency that I know of that does conduct it is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service out in the West Coast, and some research labs also in an academic setting may be researching different areas of DNA from animals based on clinical trials and things of that nature. But from a forensic setting, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does do forensic DNA testing on certain animals, and that's primarily to identify poachers and things of that nature. But if there's a specific case, I would recommend contacting them out west and see if they can't direct you to a good avenue.
Okay. So you don't think any of the private labs would do that? Could you hire a private lab to do that?
Yeah, not to my knowledge.
Okay. Hold on, I just have a couple more that are coming in here. Actually, one question that's I think is very interesting. What has the impact been of the Supreme Court decision last summer that requires lab analysts to testify in court rather than just entering a report? of finding?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's commonly known as the Melendez-Diaz decision in the state of Virginia, and it's primarily it hasn't really impacted the DNA scientists per se in the majority of states. That ruling affected cases where people were trying to introduce just a notarized report as opposed to having the analyst available to cross-examine. And in Virginia, what happens is the statute that they had in place was that the burden was on the defendant to notify the state whether or not they wanted to cross-examine an individual in a drug case, for example. In Alabama, our statute is the flip side of that. We routinely notify them and say, here's our report. If you want us available in a drug case, then you've got 60 or 90 days to notify us, and we'll go there. But throughout the community, there has been a lot of confusion and anxiety about people being pulled out of the lab to go to court, and hopefully that'll get resolved in a timely manner.
Okay, we have time for about, I guess, 2 more probably, it looks like, and we have some coming in that we'll answer by email. I want to note that there are a few that seem like some questions that are really best probably answered by we have the same webinar on March 2nd, and that probably would be a good time for those of you who are asking some of these really specific questions about collection. It'd be good for you to be on that webinar, and then you could ask, there'd be 2 SANE nurses on that webinar, and you could ask those questions then. But we'll try to get back to you on that after this webinar is over. Here's a question. In regards to identical twins, is there enough difference in the DNA to determine which individual of the 2 is the match?
With returns to identical twins, no. There is some very recent research that looks at copy number variation, but in a forensic setting, identical twins look from the DNA profile look the exact same in the areas that are commonly looked at. What's important to note with identical twins is that the friction ridge fingerprints, so your conventional fingerprints that are present on each of your digits of your hand, those are different between identical twins. So, in fact, we've had rape cases where the suspect was an identical twin, but then the fingerprints at the crime scene were obviously just one of the brothers, and the other one wasn't there. But no, we can't tell them apart in a forensic lab if they're truly identical twins. They'll have the same DNA profile.
Okay. And one just clarification point, I had a question that somebody was confused. The military DNA profiles are not part of the CODIS. Is that right? A separate database, or?
There's actually 2 databases. The military, so if somebody is charged and court-martialed or charged with a military crime, those individual samples are linked to CODIS through the U.S. Army Crime Lab from Fort Gillem in Georgia. So yes, those military offenders and military unsolved cases are part of CODIS. What's not part of CODIS is the routine, what I call the military dog tag samples that are routinely collected and stored in the event they need to be compared for military reasons. If a Black Hawk helicopter goes down, they need to identify who was on the helicopter. That's not a CODIS function per se. Okay.
I'm just going to throw the one last question out here. If you are working a case and the perp fled back to one of the countries with CODIS, what can be done?
And the perp fled back to a country with CODIS?
Yeah, to another country that has CODIS?
Sure. Then we would use that connectivity with Interpol, or using the legal attaché in that case or in that country to try and either extradite or develop a confirmatory sample for the individual.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks everyone for all of your questions. If we didn't get to your question, we will get back to you on email, and we're out of time. I want to thank Angelo for his presentation. I want to note also that the presentation was recorded and will be available online. We'll send an email out in a couple of days with that link, and also the slides from the webinar will be posted on our website. So that will come out sometime midweek. And remember to visit our website to learn more about future webinars and our trainings. And we also will have an evaluation. When you log off of this webinar, you'll see an evaluation pop up. If you could fill that out for us, we'd be really grateful. So we hope to see you on a future webinar, and thanks for listening.